the things that I've got to touch on this morning, this is absolutely for me, and I figure if it's for me, there's a good shot it can help some other people too, because maybe we're not all that different. In John, let's start with a look at, let's go to chapter 4. And this, of course, is the story of Jesus talking to the woman at the well. It's a fairly long passage, so I'm not going to read through it entirely. But essentially what occurs here, the disciples and Jesus have been on a journey. They get to Jacob's well. Jesus takes a load off. The disciples are sent into town to go get some food and bring it back to Jesus. While Jesus is sitting there, a Samaritan woman comes in the middle of the day, and she sees this Jewish rabbi sitting by the well. So they strike up a conversation, and much to her shock and awe, he doesn't, tell her to run off. He's actually pretty nice to her. But through this interaction, we learn a lot of things about this woman. We know that she is a Samaritan, obviously. We know, based on what Jesus said, that she has been married 5 times before, and that she is now with a man who is not her husband. Now, I will say, a lot of times people like to jump on her and say, oh, well, it must be that she's been married and divorced 5 times, and now she's just shacking up with some guy that's not her husband. But, I'm more than happy to give her the benefit of the doubt in saying that at least maybe some of those marriages ended because perhaps her husband died. At this point in time, there's, definitely plenty of reasons that could result in that happening. But regardless, we do know that the fact that she's been married 5 times is not something that is a positive thing for her socially, at the very least. So coming into this interaction, she has a lot of expectations about how this is going to go. I would imagine that as she's walking up to the well, maybe she comes around that corner, around the vegetation or whatever, but as she gets close enough to see that there is someone there, and then sees that not only is there someone there, but it's actually a Jewish rabbi, her expectations for how this interaction is going to go is probably not all that great. And then later in the story, the disciples come back, and they see that Jesus is talking to someone, not only to someone, but talking to this woman, of all people. And not just telling her to get out of the way. He's talking to her in a way that they surely did not expect. I do find some humor in Jesus' interaction with them. They've gone into town to get food, and they come back and they say to him, Rabbi, why don't you eat something? And he says, I've got food that you don't know about. They've just gone into town, dealt with all the Samaritans. They've gotten food, they've come back, and then Jesus says, oh, I've got food you don't know about. I would imagine there was probably a little bit of a ruckus at that point amongst the disciples, if nothing else, maybe a little bit of angst. But of course, Jesus goes on to explain that his food is to do the will of his Father who sent him. The thing that I take away from this story is, it's hard to describe, but up till this point, Jesus has not, there's a lot of supposition out there, but Jesus has not yet said to anyone, I am the Messiah. But in this interaction, we see, lost track of it. In verse 26, the woman says, we know that there's a time when the Messiah will come, and Jesus says to her, I who am speaking to you am he. We've considered this woman's expectations for this interaction, but let's also take another step back and think about what were her expectations for her life. If all of these things are true about her, then she had likely resigned herself to the idea that she was going to live an extraordinarily insignificant and meaningless, maybe, life. No one was expecting anything even good, much less great, wonderful, or extraordinary from this woman. Their expectations for her were about as negative as they could get. Not only among her people, but particularly amongst essentially everyone else. To the Jews, this woman would have been just about the most insignificant being on the face of the planet. But Jesus, in this incidental meeting at this well, takes all of those expectations and completely turns them on their head. Because in this interaction, Jesus makes this Samaritan woman, whose life is such a shambles and is so insignificant, and gives to her first the single most important information that has ever been delivered to any human being ever to walk the face of the earth. That Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah. Wow. The expectation versus what God actually did are so incredibly juxtaposed and opposite from one another that it's hard to even wrap our minds around. But this is one of many examples of redemption that Jesus shows us. Let's take a couple of pages back and go take a look in chapter 2 at the very first miracle that Jesus ever did. That, of course, being the incident that happened at that wedding at Cana. So, Jewish weddings, particularly in the first century, were a really, really big deal. All of your reputation, your family's reputation, the beginning of your reputation for your own household with your new wife, all of this is bearing on how does this wedding play out? How is the feast? How is the party? It's such an enormous event that in our 2020 American minds, we can't really wrap our heads around it. But just suffice it to say that this is huge. And disaster has absolutely struck because they have run out of wine. You do not do that. Ever. This is about the worst thing that could have possibly happened. So expectations at this point are pretty low. Until Mary goes and gets Jesus and says, "Hey, they're out of wine." And Jesus looks at Mary and kind of says, "Uh-huh. What's this got to do with me, woman?" As your Bible likely translates it, which I find kind of funny. Mary doesn't even respond to him. She just looks at everybody else in the room and says, "Just whatever he tells you to do, just do it." And then she leaves. And I've always kind of pictured this as, I don't know if any of you have ever watched Everybody Loves Raymond, but Marie Barone, I kind of imagine Mary doing this the way Marie would do it. You know, she's just going to tell you how it's going to be, and then she's going to leave and expect that what she just said is going to happen. You know, the bossy mom character, right? So Jesus, I imagine, kind of takes a deep breath. All right. Well, all right. How about this? Y'all know those big wash basins outside? And everybody kind of thinks, yeah, those nasty things. He's like, yeah, go get those and make sure that they're full, and then bring them on in here. Like, what? Now, if you're not familiar, these wash basins, they each hold, 20, 30 gallons apiece, and they're used for, washing all of the plates and the utensils, and then everybody uses them to, the water from them to wash their hands. And this is not only to physically wash away whatever dirt there might be, but it was also a spiritual purification. So this is really the nastiest liquid that you could possibly have found anywhere. This is literally the last thing that any good Jewish person would want to have anything to do with. And yet, they do what Jesus tells them to do. And then he takes it a step further and says, go ahead and dip some of that out, put it in a cup, and then go take it to the guy in charge of the whole party. Okay, this Jesus guy has completely lost his mind at this point. I mean, we thought things were bad before, but this is really going to blow things up. I don't know why Jesus has it out for these people who just got married. I don't know why he wants to start them off so terribly. But okay, whatever you say. And then as the story plays out, we see that not only is everything fine, not only does Jesus save the day, not only does he actually turn it into wine, he turns it into the best wine that these people have ever tasted in their entire lives. He took literally the thing that was absolutely the worst. There was nothing more dirty to be found, and turned it into the most desirable beverage the people at this wedding had ever known. Jesus took the Samaritan woman at the well, a woman whose life was destined to amount to nothing, and made her the most important messenger on the face of the planet. God has a real knack for taking the things from which we expect nothing or worse than nothing and turning them into things that are so amazing and wonderful that we can't even comprehend it. I mean, this is just two stories. The Bible's full of this stuff. And in these two stories, the people around were not, nowhere close to expecting what happened. The disciples didn't expect what Jesus was doing. They were still talking about food. The Samaritan woman didn't expect, she was almost kind of getting sassy with Jesus. And much less did she expect to find out that the guy that she was standing there talking to was actually the one that she'd been waiting for. The people at the wedding, when they found out that they had run out of wine, their expectation was that this was a catastrophic event, to say the least, and it was going to set the tone for the rest of their lives. They were going to spend the rest of their lives battling this image that had arisen from that wedding they had where they ran out of wine. But instead, we continue 2,000 years later to talk about the message that that Samaritan woman shared for the first time. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands have followed in her footsteps to be the ones to go and tell people about the Messiah that they found. The people who got married in Cana that day, people continued to talk about them for sure, but not because they were talking badly about how they had run out of wine. Instead, they were talking about how they threw the wedding and party for the ages. And the wine at no wedding will ever compare to the wine that we had at that wedding that day. It is the standard by which all other wines will be measured. Wine magazine wouldn't even have a rating for it. It was just off the charts. Incidentally, I don't know if you've heard any young kids, when they have a large amount of something, saying that they have a buttload of it. But as it turns out, that's actually a real measurement. And one of my favorite facts about that story ever is that the amount of wine that Jesus made that day in Cana is roughly a buttload. So there's that. But he made so much that they couldn't even drink it all. It wasn't only that good, it was that good, and they had more than they could ever use. Abundance. Redemption in abundance. Abundance such that we can't even comprehend it. And these people, their expectations were not that. So now is the part where I turn things around and start to talk to myself a little bit. And if it talks to you too, then that's awesome. But I was taking a look last night, looking at some of the things that have happened so far this year. We had the Hong Kong protests. Our president was impeached. Oil prices went negative. The Olympics were canceled. Kobe Bryant was killed in the helicopter crash. One of our Supreme Court justices has passed away. Ebola has resurfaced in Africa. And all of that is under the shadow of this virus called COVID-19. That's just a very shortened list of some of the globally negative events that have occurred. And it's easy when we think about all these things to get into a mode where we're just kind of waiting for the next terrible thing. I've found myself looking forward to New Year's more this year than ever before. I know for me, New Year's is always kind of a bittersweet thing. I don't know why I've never understood it, but it always just kind of plays with me a little bit, and I'm always kind of sad to see an old year go. Not this year. I mean, a lot of us, we're kind of getting up every day wondering, well, what's it going to be today? How much money are we going to lose in our investments? Who's going to die? Who's going to get sick? What random negative event is going to happen in my personal life? And we're all ready to we're just going to blame it on 2020. I think Milli Vanilli could come back and rewrite that song and get whoever they want to sing it, and they could have a hit. But is that what we as Christians should be doing? We can see so many times in the Bible where things are terrible, and arguably much worse than what we're dealing with now, and yet in all of those situations, God does His redemptive thing. Are we expecting God to redeem us from all of these things that are going on? And if we are, do our actions show it? Sometimes mine don't. And I know they don't because I see people around me taking cues from me. Everett now gets to join the club, including Paisley and Emily, because I'm going to talk about him for a minute. A few nights ago, we had another thing happening at the house. And I walked by the door to Everett's room, and I saw him sitting there on the edge of the bed, and he had little pieces of torn up paper all over everywhere on the floor. And I was like, this is around. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? I was like, what's that? I said, well, it's a piece of paper, and it used to say 2020 on it. He was so fed up. He had written 2020 on a piece of paper just so he could tear it up and throw it on the floor. And then he went from that wasn't good enough. He went from that to gathering up all the pieces. He went and ran them under the water and then just squeezed all the water out of them. And then he was ready to burn it. And I said, well, that's great, but wet stuff usually doesn't burn too well. So at that point, he made another piece of paper with 2020 on it and said, well, we'll burn this one later. But, it's humorous on the surface, but the more I thought about it, the more I wondered about what kind of expectations I'm modeling. Am I showing in my actions that I expect God to do what God always does? Or am I allowing the disparaging side of things to get the best of me? Are we shining our light, so to speak, of expectation of redemption, or are we just lying down in the mire of humanity around us and going along with everyone else's negative mindset? Because I've become convicted that I need to have a more positive mindset. I need to be showing in my actions that I expect God to redeem all of this. Not just this year, but all of this. that there is a day coming where it's all going to be made right. That our bodies are not going to be susceptible to viruses anymore. That we're not going to be worried about money. And we're not going to be worried about where our next meals are going to come from. And we're not going to be worried about social unrest. We're not going to be worried about race relations. Because it will be abundantly clear that there is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no Gentile, there is no black, white. All of that is gone and done. I want to invite you to take on a more positive expectation.
Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages let his praises ring. Glory in the highest I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God.